Dr. Tom Smith walked down the clean, white halls of City Hospital on a sunny Monday morning. Everyone loved him. He was tall, had friendly gray hair, and always wore a clean white doctor's coat with a shiny name tag. The nurses called him the kind doctor because he was so nice to his sick patients. He had worked at City Hospital for 20 years, and today in 2019, they were planning a big party to celebrate. Jenny Brown was new at the hospital. She had been a nurse there for only 6 months. She stood at the front desk, watching Dr. Smith talk to his patients. He would sit with them, hold their hands, and smile. But lately, Jenny noticed something strange about his smile. It didn't look real anymore. It reminded her of someone wearing a mask. Jenny was writing in her patient books when she saw Mrs. Mary Wilson's file. Mrs. Wilson had died last week. She had cancer, and everyone thought she would live for at least a few more months. This was the third patient of Dr. Smith's who had died this month. All of them died at night, in their sleep. People said this was normal in a cancer ward, but Jenny remembered something that scared her. That night, Jenny had checked on Mrs. Wilson at 2 o'clock in the morning. Mrs. Wilson was doing better and had even eaten some soup. Then Dr. Smith showed up out of nowhere. He told Jenny to go take her break, saying he would watch Mrs. Wilson himself. When Jenny came back 30 minutes later, Mrs. Wilson was dead. Dr. Smith was already writing that she had died from her heart stopping. But Jenny found something scary later that night. Hidden in the trash, there was an empty medicine bottle. It was a type of medicine that should never be in that part of the hospital. Now, as she watched Dr. Smith walk away, she thought about all the patients who had died in the past 2 years. How many families had thanked him, thinking their loved ones had died peacefully. Jenny kept a small blue notebook in her desk drawer. In it, she wrote down weird things she noticed. When patients died, missing medicines, and when Dr. Smith came to the hospital late at night. She had been writing in it for months now, and it told a scary story. But who would believe her? Everyone thought Dr. Smith was the best doctor in the city. He had won many awards and was friends with all the hospital bosses. Just then, Dr. Smith turned around and saw Jenny watching him. He smiled and walked over to her desk. Jenny quickly closed her drawer. "Jenny," he said in his friendly voice, "can you help me with Mr. Bob Lee in room 12? He's not feeling good, and I think we need to make him more comfortable tonight." The way he said comfortable made Jenny feel cold all over. When she looked at his face, she saw something scary in his eyes. Just for a second, Jenny felt like she was carrying a heavy secret. If she was right, Dr. Smith had been killing patients for 20 years, while everyone thought he was helping them. If she was wrong, she would ruin his life and lose her job. But as Dr. Smith gave her Mr. Lee's papers, Jenny knew what she had to do. She couldn't let another patient die. She just needed proof. Real proof that no one could deny. Tonight might be her only chance to get it. Later that day, Dr. Smith sat in his office. He had noticed how Jenny looked at him differently now. He saw her checking the trash and staying late to read old patient files. In his desk, behind a fake wooden panel, he had a small black notebook. In it were names of people who had asked too many questions over the years. Some of these people weren't around anymore. Some had moved away suddenly. Others had strange accidents. Dr. Smith took out his pen and wrote Jenny's name at the bottom of the list. But what Dr. Smith didn't know was that Jenny wasn't working alone anymore. She had sent a letter to someone who could help her. Someone who had been looking for Dr. Smith for a very long time. In another city, a man named Detective Mike Jones held Jenny's letter in his hands. 20 years ago, his sister had been Dr. Smith's patient at another hospital. She had died mysteriously in the middle of the night. Now, finally, he had a chance to find out the truth. In her apartment that night, Jenny pulled out a second notebook from under her mattress. This one wasn't filled with notes about Dr. Smith. Instead, it contained something much more dangerous. Proof that Dr. Smith wasn't even his real name. She had discovered his picture in an old newspaper from 20 years ago, under a different name, at a different hospital, where 5 patients had died mysteriously. But before she could read more, her phone rang. It was Dr. Smith. "Jenny," he said cheerfully, "could you come in early tomorrow? There's something important I need to show you." Jenny's hand shook as she drove to City Hospital early the next morning. The sun hadn't come up yet, and the empty parking lot felt scary in the dark. She had spent all night hiding her notebooks, the blue one in a box of old shoes, and the secret one with the newspaper clipping behind a loose brick in her kitchen wall. She had also made copies of everything and mailed them to her sister in another city, just in case. When she walked into the hospital at 5 a.m., only the emergency lights were on. The halls were quiet, except for the soft beeping of machines. Dr. Smith stood at the end of the hallway, his white coat glowing in the dim light. "Good morning, Jenny," he smiled. "Thank you for coming early. I have something special to show you in the basement storage room." Jenny's heart beat faster. The basement storage room was where they kept old patient files and medicine supplies. Nobody went there at this hour. I need to check on Mr. Lee first," she said quickly, but Dr. Smith's smile didn't change. "Oh, don't worry about Bob Lee," he said softly. "He passed away peacefully last night. Such a shame you weren't there to help." Jenny felt sick to her stomach. Mr. Lee had been getting better. She was supposed to help him take his medicine last night, but Dr. Smith had called her in early today instead. Now she understood why. As she followed Dr. Smith to the basement stairs, she secretly pressed the record button on her phone in her pocket. The basement was cold and smelled like old paper. Dr. Smith led her past rows of metal shelves to a door she had never seen before. "You know, Jenny," he said as he took out a key, "I've noticed how interested you are in my work, always checking files, looking through the trash." He opened the door to reveal a small office. "I thought you might like to see where I keep my special records." Inside, Jenny saw walls covered with pictures, smiling photos of patients who had died. Below each picture was a date and a note. Her eyes fell on Mrs. Wilson's photo, and next to it, she saw the empty medicine bottle she had found in the trash. Dr. Smith had kept it like a trophy. "Why are you showing me this?" Jenny whispered. Dr. Smith closed the door behind them. "Because, Jenny," he said, his friendly smile finally disappearing, "you remind me of Linda Jones. She was a nurse too, 20 years ago. Too smart for her own good." He pointed to an old photo on the wall. After she disappeared, her brother became a detective, trying to find out what happened to her. He's been chasing me ever since. Jenny's phone buzzed in her pocket. She jumped, but it was just a text message. Dr. Smith didn't notice. He was too busy looking at his wall of pictures. "The funny thing is," he continued, "Detective Jones is closer than he thinks. He just doesn't know that Dr. Tom Smith used to be Dr. Bill Anderson. Or before that, Dr. James Wilson. Would you like to know how many other names I've had, Jenny?" Just then, they heard footsteps upstairs. The morning shift nurses were starting to arrive. Dr. Smith's smile returned. "Well, we'll have to finish our chat later. But first," he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bottle filled with clear liquid. "I think it's time for your medicine, Jenny. We can't have you sharing our little secret, can we?" But what Dr. Smith didn't know was that Jenny's phone buzz wasn't just a text message. When she had pressed record, her phone had also sent an emergency signal to Detective Jones, who was already in town. And right now, he was walking into City Hospital's front door with a team of police officers. Suddenly, the basement lights went out. In the darkness, Jenny heard Dr. Smith laugh softly. "Looks like we're having a power problem," he said. "Don't worry, I can give you your medicine in the dark. I've had lots of practice." But Jenny smiled in the darkness too, because what Dr. Smith couldn't see was the small red light blinking on her phone, still recording everything. And he couldn't hear the elevator doors opening down the hall, bringing Detective Jones closer with every second. In the dark basement, Jenny backed away from Dr. Smith's voice. Her hand touched a cold metal shelf, and she knocked over some empty boxes to confuse him about where she was. The small bottle in Dr. Smith's hand made a soft clicking sound as he moved in the darkness. "You can't hide, Jenny," he said softly. "I've worked in this basement for 20 years. I know every corner." Suddenly, Jenny remembered something important. Linda Jones hadn't just disappeared. According to the old newspaper in Jenny's secret notebook, she had last been seen in a hospital basement. Now, 20 years later, Jenny was trapped in the same situation. But she had one advantage Linda didn't have. She knew about the hospital's old building plans. Last week, while looking through old files, Jenny had found a map of the basement from 40 years ago. It showed a second door that had been covered up during rebuilding. The door led to an old tunnel that workers used to use to move supplies. If she could find it in the dark... "You know what's interesting, Jenny?" Dr. Smith's voice came closer. "Most people think doctors who hurt their patients must be crazy. But I'm not crazy. I help people. I free them from their pain, just like I helped your father last year." Jenny froze. Her father had died at City Hospital last year, before she started working there. The doctor said it was a heart attack. What did you say?" she whispered. "Oh, yes." Dr. Smith laughed softly. "John Brown. He wasn't even my patient, but I saw his name on a form and recognized it. Sweet Jenny Brown, who had just applied for a nursing job. I knew you'd be trouble, just like Linda, so I paid your father a special visit one night. Think of it as a welcome gift." Jenny's sadness turned to anger. She had spent the last year feeling guilty about not being there when her father died. Now she knew the truth. Her hand touched the wall behind her. Feeling for the hidden door, she knew, was there. Dr. Smith's footsteps came closer. Above them, Detective Mike Jones and his team were searching the hospital's first floor. But they didn't know about the basement office. Nobody did, except Jenny. Her fingers found a crack in the wall, the outline of the old door. But before she could push it, the basement light suddenly came back on. Jenny and Dr. Smith stared at each other. She was trapped between him and the wall. The bottle of poison glinted in his hand. But then Jenny saw something that made her smile. Behind Dr. Smith, reflected in a dusty old mirror on the shelf, she saw a familiar face. Detective Jones stood quietly in the office doorway, his gun pointed at Dr. Smith's back. "You know what else is interesting, Dr. Smith?" Jenny said, standing up straighter. Linda Jones was left-handed. All her notes in the old patient files were written with her left hand. Just like the note I found in your secret office last week, hidden behind the pictures. Linda left a message before she disappeared. Dr. Smith's face changed. For the first time, he looked scared. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I burned all her notes." "Not all of them," said a voice behind him. Dr. Smith spun around to face Detective Jones. "My sister was smart," Jones said. "She wrote a note about a young doctor named Bill Anderson and hid it where she knew I'd find it someday, inside our mother's old Bible. I've been following your name changes for 20 years. But Dr. Smith smiled again. "You have no proof," he said. "Just an old note and some stories. I'm a respected doctor. Nobody will believe you." He lifted his hand to throw the bottle of poison at Jenny. At that same moment, 3 things happened at once. Detective Jones shouted, "Don't move!" Jenny pushed hard against the wall behind her, and Dr. Smith's secret office door slowly opened by itself. In the doorway stood someone nobody expected to see, someone who made Dr. Smith's face turn white with shock, someone everyone thought was dead. "Actually," said Mrs. Mary Wilson, very much alive, "I think people will believe me." Mrs. Wilson walked into the basement office, supported by 2 police officers. She looked weak, but very much alive, wearing a hospital gown from another facility. Dr. Smith's hand with the poison bottle began to shake. "This is impossible," he whispered. "I gave you enough medicine to... He stopped talking, realizing he was confessing. "To kill me?" Mrs. Wilson finished his sentence. "Yes, you did. But what you didn't know was that Jenny had already switched my medicines that night." She turned to Jenny with grateful eyes. "When Jenny found your pattern in the patient files, she started replacing the night medicines of patients she thought might be in danger. She gave me the real medicine before you came that night and helped me escape through that same hidden door after you left." Jenny stepped forward. "I couldn't save Mr. Lee last night because you made sure I wasn't there. But I did save 5 other patients in the last month. They're all safe at different hospitals now, ready to tell their stories." Dr. Smith looked around wildly, like a trapped animal. The poison bottle dropped from his hand and rolled under a shelf. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "I was helping them. They were in pain. I ended their suffering. I'm a good doctor." "A good doctor?" Detective Jones picked up a folder from Dr. Smith's desk. "Let's talk about all your different names. After Linda disappeared, you changed your name from Bill Anderson to James Wilson, then to Robert Davis, then Tom Smith. At each hospital, patients died, but you made one big mistake." Dr. Smith backed away until he hit the wall of photos. "What mistake?" he asked. Detective Jones smiled. "Linda wasn't just my sister. She was also training to be a handwriting expert. She noticed something about your signatures on death certificates, tiny details that most people wouldn't see. Even when you changed your name, you couldn't completely change your handwriting. For 20 years, I've been collecting your signatures from every hospital you worked at. They all match." But Dr. Smith wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on something behind Jenny. Everyone turned to look. There, stepping through the hidden door, came more people. 10, 20, 30 former patients who had escaped Dr. Smith's help over the years. Each one had a story. Each one had proof. "It's over, doctor," Jenny said quietly. "All these years, you kept pictures of the patients you thought you had killed, but you didn't know that some of us were building a different kind of picture, a picture of who you really are." Dr. Smith suddenly reached into his other pocket. Instead of another poison bottle, he pulled out a small remote control. "You think it's over?" he laughed. "This basement has an old security system. One push of this button, and steel doors will seal all the exits. Nobody will leave until I say so." He pressed the button. A loud alarm started ringing, but nothing else happened. No doors closed. No locks clicked. "Looking for this?" came a new voice. Everyone turned to see a hospital maintenance man walking in, holding up some cut wires. "Name's Joe. I've worked here for 30 years. Jenny asked me to disconnect the old system last week. Told me she was worried about safety violations. Guess she was right." Dr. Smith made one last desperate move. He reached up and pulled hard on one of the metal shelves. Boxes and files came crashing down, creating chaos in the small room. He tried to run through the hidden door, but he forgot something important. Linda's note hadn't been the only thing Jenny found in his office last week. As he ran into the dark tunnel, his foot caught on a thin wire, a simple trap Jenny had set, using supplies from the maintenance room. Dr. Smith fell hard right into the arms of 2 waiting police officers. Later, as they led Dr. Smith away in handcuffs, Jenny noticed something strange about his face. His smile was finally gone, replaced by his true expression, one of defeat. But there was something else too, something that sent chills down her spine. In his eyes, she saw him calculating, planning, still thinking he could outsmart them all. What nobody knew was that Dr. Smith had one more secret. Hidden in his house, in a place no one had found yet, there was another notebook, and on its last page, written in the same handwriting that had finally caught him, was a list of names. Doctors at other hospitals who shared his ideas about helping patients. The last line on the page read, "In case of emergency, contact Dr. Sarah White at Metro Hospital." The case wasn't over. It was just beginning. While Dr. Smith sat in his jail cell that night, Jenny and Detective Jones searched his small house on Oak Street. The police had already looked through it, but Jenny had a feeling they'd missed something. "Dr. Smith likes to hide things behind other things," she explained, tapping on walls and checking behind picture frames, just like the fake panel in his office desk. In the kitchen, Detective Jones found old newspapers hidden under the sink. All of them had stories about patients dying peacefully in different hospitals. Some were from cities they hadn't known about before. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a photo. "Metro Hospital had 10 unexpected deaths last month. And the doctor quoted in the article is Dr. Sarah White," Jenny finished, looking over his shoulder. The woman in the photo was smiling, standing next to a group of nurses. But what caught Jenny's eye was the small pin on Dr. White's coat. It was exactly like one she had seen in Dr. Smith's office. Suddenly they heard a noise upstairs. Jenny and Detective Jones looked at each other. The house was supposed to be empty. They climbed the stairs quietly, following the sound to a small room at the end of the hall. Inside, they found an old woman going through Dr. Smith's desk drawers. "Freeze!" Detective Jones pulled out his gun, but the old woman just smiled. "Hello, Mike," she said calmly. "You've grown so much since I last saw you. You look just like your sister Linda now." Detective Jones's hand started shaking. "Mom?" he whispered. Mrs. Jones stood up slowly, holding a thick notebook. "When Linda disappeared, I knew she must have found something dangerous. So I started my own investigation. I've been following doctors like Tom Smith for 20 years, building my own list. But I couldn't tell you, Mike. They were watching you too closely." Jenny took the notebook and opened it. Inside were hundreds of names, dates, and hospital records. But more surprisingly, there were detailed notes about a secret group called the Healers. Doctors who believed they had the right to decide when patients should die. "Dr. Sarah White isn't just another killer doctor," Mrs. Jones explained. "She's their leader. Every doctor in the group wears a special pin, a small golden hand. It's how they recognize each other. Tom Smith was just one member of a much bigger organization." Before anyone could respond, Jenny's phone rang. It was Joe, the maintenance man from the hospital. "Jenny," his voice was shaking, "you need to see the news, right now." They rushed downstairs and turned on Dr. Smith's old TV. Breaking news flashed across the screen. "Dr. Tom Smith found dead in jail cell." The reporter explained that he had apparently died from a heart attack. But Jenny, Detective Jones, and Mrs. Jones all looked at each other. They knew better. "The Healers got to him," Mrs. Jones said quietly. "They couldn't risk him talking." Jenny's phone buzzed again, a text message from an unknown number. "Dear Nurse Brown, I hear you're interested in our work. We should meet. I have some patients at Metro Hospital who need special care. Dr. S.W. They don't know we have this notebook," Detective Jones said, "or that Mom has been tracking them. Maybe we can..." But Jenny wasn't listening. She was staring at an old photo that had fallen from the notebook. It showed a young Dr. Sarah White standing in a hospital room 20 years ago. And there, in the background, barely visible but definitely alive, was Linda Jones, wearing a nurse's uniform and the same golden pin. "Linda's not dead," Jenny whispered. "She didn't disappear. She joined them." Detective Jones grabbed the photo, his hands trembling. "No," he said. "No, my sister would never—" "People change, Mike," his mother said sadly. "The question is, what do we do now?" Dr. White is expecting Jenny to reply to that text, and somewhere in Metro Hospital, Linda is waiting. Just then, all of their phones buzzed at once. Another breaking news alert. Mass patient deaths reported at 5 hospitals across the country. The healers weren't just a small group. They were starting something big, and they wanted Jenny to be part of it. Jenny stared at Dr. White's text message for a long time before typing, "I'm interested. When can we meet?" Her hands were shaking, but she knew they had to play along to stop what was happening at the other hospitals. "You can't go alone," Detective Jones said, still holding the photo of his sister Linda. "It's too dangerous." But his mother had another idea. "She won't be alone," Mrs. Jones said. "I'm going back to nursing." When they looked confused, she explained, "I kept my nursing license active all these years, waiting for a chance like this. Metro Hospital is hiring night nurses. I already applied last week when I saw Dr. White's name in the news." 3 days later, Jenny walked into Metro Hospital wearing her nurse's uniform. Mrs. Jones, now known as Nurse Helen Parker, was working on the same floor. They pretended not to know each other. Detective Jones and his team were watching the hospital from a van across the street. Dr. Sarah White was exactly like her photo. Tall, elegant, with perfect gray hair and a warm smile that didn't reach her eyes. The golden handpin sparkled on her white coat. "Jenny Brown," she said sweetly. "I've heard so much about you. Dr. Smith was right. You're very observant." Jenny's heart skipped a beat. How did Dr. White know what Dr. Smith thought of her? But before she could think about it more, she saw someone walking down the hall, a nurse, older now, but still recognizable from the photo, Linda Jones. Linda walked right past them, not even looking at Jenny. But Jenny noticed something odd. Linda's golden pin was different from Dr. White's. It was turned upside down. "Let me show you our special care unit," Dr. White said, leading Jenny through double doors. Inside, Jenny saw something that made her blood run cold. Every patient was hooked up to the same type of medicine pump, the kind that could be controlled from a central computer. "Tonight's going to be very special," Dr. White whispered. "At midnight, the healers will help patients at 50 hospitals across the country. All at once, a message to the world about mercy." She touched her golden pin. "And you'll be part of it." Jenny realized with horror what she meant. The medicine pumps would all be triggered at once. Hundreds of patients would die at exactly midnight. She had to do something, but Dr. White wasn't letting her out of her sight. Then Jenny saw Linda again, standing at the medicine storage room door. Their eyes met for a second. Linda held up her upside-down pin, then pointed to the computer room down the hall. She mouthed one word: "Files." Jenny understood. The upside-down pin wasn't just decoration. It was a signal. Linda hadn't joined the healers. She had infiltrated them, gathering evidence all these years. Suddenly, all the lights in the hospital went out. Emergency lights came on, casting everything in a dim red glow. Dr. White's phone rang. "What?" she snapped. "What do you mean the computer system is down? Fix it. We have 2 hours until midnight." In the confusion, Jenny slipped away from Dr. White. She ran to the computer room, where she found Linda already downloading files onto a small drive. 20 years, Linda said quietly. 20 years of collecting names, dates, records. I couldn't stop them alone. But now? Before she could finish, they heard Dr. White's voice in the hallway. "Find them! Both of them! Nobody leaves this hospital until midnight." But Dr. White had forgotten about one other person, the new night nurse, Helen Parker. Mrs. Jones had used her maintenance key to get into the power room and shut down the hospital's systems. Now all the doors were locked, trapping the healers inside their own hospital. As police sirens filled the air outside, Jenny's phone buzzed one last time. Another text from an unknown number. "Look in the basement. They've been hiding more than just files." Joe. Jenny and Linda looked at each other. What else would they find in Metro Hospital's basement? And more importantly, would they find it before midnight? Jenny and Linda raced down the emergency stairs to the basement, while Mrs. Jones kept watch upstairs. The Metro Hospital basement was bigger than city hospitals, with long, dark hallways that seemed to go on forever. Their flashlight beams bounced off old medical equipment and dusty boxes. "Wait," Linda whispered, pulling Jenny behind a large cabinet. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Through a crack, they saw two doctors wearing the golden handpins hurrying past, carrying boxes of files. "They're destroying evidence," Jenny said, but Linda shook her head. "No, they're moving something. Look." She pointed to wet footprints on the floor leading to a wall. The footprints went right through the wall. Moving closer, they found another hidden door, just like at City Hospital, but this one led down to an even lower level, one that wasn't on any hospital maps. As they carefully walked down the wet stairs, they heard voices. One of them was Dr. White's. "Move everything to the backup location," she was saying. "The police can't find them. 20 years of work, our special patients." Jenny and Linda reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. The basement opened into a huge room filled with hospital beds. But these weren't normal patients. Each person was in what looked like a deep sleep, kept alive by machines. "Oh my God," Linda gasped. "These are all the patients we thought they killed. They didn't die. They're test subjects." A computer screen nearby showed a map of the country with 50 red dots, one for each hospital involved in the healers plan. But there was something else. Notes on the screen talked about a new medicine, something the healers had been testing on these sleeping patients for years. "They're not just killing patients," Jenny realized. "They're using them to test new drugs. The Midnight Plan isn't just about killing. It's about giving this new medicine to patients all over the country." "But why?" "Because it works," said a voice behind them. Dr. White stepped out of the shadows holding a gun. "This medicine lets us control when and how people die. No pain, no choice, no messy goodbyes, pure mercy. And after tonight, when hundreds of patients die peacefully at exactly midnight, other doctors will see that we were right all along." "You're wrong," another voice said. Joe, the maintenance man, stepped out from behind some machines. "I've been watching you for months, ever since I found this place while fixing a leak." He held up his phone. "And I've been recording everything you just said." Dr. White laughed. "Poor Joe. Did you really think we didn't know about you?" She pointed up. More doctors with golden pins surrounded them, all holding guns. "You've all been so busy watching us. You didn't notice we were watching you too. Even you, Linda. Did you really think we believed you for 20 years? But now it was Linda's turn to smile. "No," she said. "We were counting on it." She reached up and touched her upside-down pin. A tiny red light started blinking. "This isn't just a pin. It's a signal beacon. And I'm not the only one wearing one." Suddenly, the sleeping patient's monitors started beeping. One by one, they began to wake up. Dr. White's face turned white with shock. Impossible! The sleeping medicine was replaced, Jenny finished. While you were watching us, the real hospital workers, the good nurses and doctors who refused to join you, they've been switching your test medicine with harmless water for weeks. These people are waking up because they were never meant to be asleep. But Dr. White wasn't done. She pulled out a small remote, just like Dr. Smith had. One push, she said, and the real medicine in the upstairs pumps will still release at midnight. You can't save everyone. That's when they heard a child's voice behind Dr. White. Looking for this, Dr. White? Everyone turned. There stood a young girl in a hospital gown, holding a bunch of wires she had pulled out of the medicine pumps. Next to her were dozens of other patients, all awake, all holding pieces of the pumps they had destroyed. Meet Amy, Jenny said, the daughter of the maintenance worker you killed last year when he found this place. She's been pretending to be sick for months, helping us from the inside. Children can go places adults can't, see things we miss. The sound of police boots thundered down the stairs. Detective Jones's voice echoed through the basement. Metro Hospital is surrounded. Everyone stay where you are. But in the confusion, Dr. White slipped away through another hidden door. As she ran, she pressed a different button on her remote. Red lights started flashing, and a computerized voice announced, "Emergency protocols activated. Facility decontamination beginning in 5 minutes." They had stopped the midnight plan, but now they had 5 minutes to find Dr. White and get everyone out before the basement was flooded with toxic cleaning gases. And somewhere in the maze of hidden tunnels, Dr. White was running toward a final secret. One that would change everything they thought they knew about the healers. "Everyone up the stairs now!" Detective Jones shouted, helping the weakened patients evacuate. Jenny, Linda, and Joe ran after Dr. White, following the sound of her footsteps through the dark tunnel. The emergency lights cast strange shadows on the wet walls. 4 minutes until decontamination, the computer voice announced. The tunnel split into 3 paths. "Split up," Jenny said. But before they could, Amy's voice called out from behind them. "Wait, I know where she's going." The young girl pointed to marks on the floor, wet footprints leading to the right tunnel. "How did you?" Linda started to ask. "I followed her down here before," Amy explained, running alongside them. "When I was pretending to be sick, she always goes this way after making her special phone calls." The tunnel ended at an old elevator. Dr. White was already inside, pressing buttons frantically. As the doors started to close, she looked at them with a strange smile. "You still don't understand," she said. "This was never about mercy. It was about power. The power to control death itself." Just before the doors closed, Amy threw something into the elevator. Dr. White's golden pin that she had picked up when it fell during the chaos. Dr. White's eyes went wide with fear. 3 minutes until decontamination. "The pin!" Linda gasped. "It's not just a beacon, it's a key. All the senior healers wear them. That's how they access their secret places." They ran to the stairs next to the elevator. "She's going up," Joe said, looking at the old dial above the elevator door. "To the top floor." "But Metro Hospital only has 8 floors, Jenny said, confused. "No," Amy said quietly. "It has 9. There's a hidden floor above the 8th. I saw it in Dr. White's special elevator, but only people with golden pins can get there." 2 minutes until decontamination. They burst out onto the 8th floor, just as the elevator continued up to the hidden 9th floor. Running to the window, they could see something strange, a glass structure on the roof, like a greenhouse, glowing with blue light. Linda pulled out her fake pin and pressed it into the wall near the ceiling. A panel slid open, revealing a narrow staircase. They climbed up just in time to see Dr. White entering the glass room. Inside was something none of them expected. The room was filled with computers and strange medical equipment, but at the center was a large tank filled with glowing blue liquid. Floating inside were what looked like sleeping people, but they weren't quite right. Their skin was too perfect, their faces too similar. Clones, Dr. White said proudly, seeing their shocked faces. 20 years of secret research. We weren't just testing medicine on those patients downstairs. We were taking their DNA, creating copies, trying to make perfect humans who would never get sick, never die, unless we wanted them to. 1 minute until decontamination. You're crazy, Jenny whispered. Am I? Dr. White laughed. Look closer at your young friend Amy. Why do you think she was so good at pretending to be sick? She wasn't pretending at all. Show them, Amy. Show them your real face. Everyone turned to Amy, who stood very still. A tear rolled down her cheek. And through it, they could see something else under her skin. Something that glowed faintly blue. Amy was our first success, Dr. White said softly. A perfect clone of the real Amy who died last year. Her father didn't die because he discovered this place. He died trying to steal her back when he realized what we'd done. But by then, she was already more than human. 30 seconds until decontamination. But Dr. White had made a mistake. While she was talking, she hadn't noticed Amy walking to the main computer. With movements too fast for a normal child, Amy's fingers flew over the keyboard. System override accepted, a new computer voice said. Decontamination canceled. Security protocols activated. Building lockdown initiated. Amy turned to Dr. White, her skin now glowing visibly blue. You forgot something important, she said in a voice that sounded both young and ancient. You made us too perfect, too smart. And we've been planning this longer than you know. The other clones in the tank began to move, their eyes opening all at once, and every single one was looking at Dr. White. Dr. White backed away from the tank as the clones pressed their hands against the glass. You don't understand, she said, her voice shaking for the first time. Everything I did was to save humanity, to make it better. No, Amy said, walking closer. You wanted to control humanity, but you created something you couldn't control. Us. Her blue glow grew stronger, filling the room with strange shadows. We can all talk to each other, you know? In our minds, every clone in every hospital. We've been sharing information, learning, waiting. Jenny looked around the room with new eyes. On the computer screens, she could see live video feeds from other hospitals. More secret ninth floors, more tanks, more clones. How many? She whispered. Thousands, Amy answered. Dr. White and the healers put us in every major hospital. They thought we would help them control death. Instead, we learned how to control the machines, the computers, the medicines. We've been saving patients they wanted to kill, switching their deadly medicines with harmless ones. Suddenly, the tank's glass began to crack. Water leaked onto the floor as the clones pushed harder. Dr. White ran to the elevator, but it wouldn't open. Amy, please, she begged. I created you. I gave you life. You gave us prison, Amy said. Her voice was joined by the others as the clones began to speak in unison. You killed the real Amy. You killed so many others. And now? The tank shattered. Glowing blue liquid poured across the floor. The clones stepped out, each one exactly like Amy, but different ages. Children, adults, elderly, all with the same knowing look in their glowing eyes. Dr. White pulled out a small black box from her coat. If I press this, it will release a virus into all the cloning tanks. Everything I created will die. But she had forgotten about the golden pin Amy had thrown into the elevator. One of the adult clones held it up. Your control systems only work with this. We've already changed all the codes. The healers have no power here anymore. Detective Jones burst through the stairway door with his police team. They stopped in shock at the scene before them. The glowing clones, the broken tank, Dr. White on her knees. "It's over," Jenny said, but Linda wasn't so sure. "What happens now?" she asked Amy. "What will you do?" Amy smiled, but it was a sad smile. "We can't stay. We're not meant for this world, not yet, but we'll keep watching, keep protecting. From now on, every hospital will have invisible guardians." The clones began to disappear, their bodies turning into blue light that floated away like fog. Only Amy remained. "Wait," Jenny called. "Where are you going?" "To other places that need us," Amy said. "There are more secret labs, more evil people trying to play with life and death. The healers weren't the only ones." She handed Jenny a small blue crystal. "If you ever need us, this will call us. But be careful. Others will want this power. Keep it safe." As Amy began to fade like the others, she looked at Dr. White one last time. "You wanted to control death, but you created new life instead. Remember that in prison." After the clones vanished, the 9th floor looked ordinary again. Just machines and empty tanks. But the golden pins all over the country stopped working that night. The healers' network fell apart as their secret doors stayed locked forever. Detective Jones arrested Dr. White, who kept mumbling about her perfect creation. But Jenny stood by the broken tank, holding the blue crystal, knowing this wasn't really the end. Somewhere in another hospital, a machine beeped strangely. A deadly medicine was quietly replaced with harmless water. And in the corner of the room, if you looked very carefully, you might see a faint blue glow, watching, protecting, waiting. But what nobody knew was that one clone hadn't left with the others. Deep in the basement of another hospital, in a city far away, a single glowing figure opened her eyes in a hidden tank, and she had Dr. White's memories. 1 year later, Jenny sat at her desk at City Hospital, now working as the head nurse. The blue crystal hung safely around her neck, hidden under her uniform. Things had mostly gone back to normal. Dr. White was in prison. The healers were gone, and the secret 9th floors of hospitals across the country had been closed down. Linda Jones had become a patient safety director, working with her brother, Detective Jones, to check hospitals for any signs of dangerous doctors. Their mother, Mrs. Jones, still worked as a nurse, keeping a watchful eye on everything. Joe had been promoted to head of maintenance, with special access to check for any hidden doors or secret rooms. But something felt different that morning. Jenny's crystal felt warm against her skin. When she checked the medicine storage room, she found all the bottles glowing slightly blue. Someone, or something, was trying to warn her. She called Linda immediately. "I think it's happening again," she said quietly. "I know," Linda replied. "We just found another hidden door at Metro Children's Hospital. But this is different. The technology inside, it's more advanced than anything Dr. White had. And there's something else. The security cameras caught someone going in last night. Jenny, she looked exactly like Dr. White." Jenny's hand shook as she held her phone. "But Dr. White is in prison. I just checked this morning." "Yes," Linda said. "The real Dr. White is in prison. But remember what Amy told us about the clones sharing memories? What if one of the clones had Dr. White's memories?" Jenny finished. "And what if she's trying to start everything again?" Just then, Jenny's computer screen flickered. Words appeared, typing themselves. "Help me. I'm not like her, but I have her memories. I know what's coming. Sarah." A map appeared on the screen, showing a network of new, secret facilities, bigger than before. But these weren't in hospitals. They were in nursing homes, schools, even daycare centers, places where nobody would think to look. Another message typed, "They're starting tonight. Not just controlling death now, controlling everything. The healers were just the beginning. The real plan is much bigger. Jenny touched her crystal. It pulsed with blue light, and suddenly she could hear Amy's voice in her head. "We knew this would happen. That's why we left you the crystal. It's not just for calling us, it's for becoming like us." Linda burst into the office. "Jenny, every hospital computer in the country just showed the same message. People are panicking." Jenny stood up, holding her crystal. "Call your brother," she said. "Call everyone. This isn't over. It's just beginning." She looked at her reflection in the window. For a moment, her eyes glowed blue. "Get ready." Sarah's message continued typing. "They're not just doctors this time. They're everywhere. Politicians, teachers, police, anyone who wants control. And they have something new. Something even the clones fear." The crystal grew warmer. Through it, Jenny could feel thousands of clones across the country, all connecting, all preparing. Amy's voice came again. "You're part of us now, Jenny. All of you are. The next chapter is starting." "What do we do?" Linda asked. Jenny watched as her hand began to glow softly blue. The crystal was changing her, just like it had changed the others, who had chosen to become guardians. "We do what we've always done," Jenny said, her voice joining with 1,000 others in her mind. "We protect people. We fight back. And this time, we're ready." Around the country, more crystals began to glow. More people began to change. A new kind of healing was beginning. Not the false mercy of the healers, but real protection for those who needed it. In her prison cell, the real Dr. White smiled. Everything was going exactly as she had planned. The clones, the crystals, even her own clone, Sarah's rebellion. It was all part of something bigger, something that had been growing for not just 20 years, but for centuries. And in a small daycare center in another city, a little girl with glowing blue eyes looked up from her drawing. She had sketched a perfect map of things that hadn't happened yet, showing a future that was rushing toward them all. The story of the healers was over, but the real story, it was just beginning.